So thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. It's great to see you. I know there are other events and sessions going on, so thank you for choosing this one. We really appreciate it. And thank you for joining online as well. There are a few people on YouTube who are watching. So what we will do is we'll have some Q&A after we've shared a few discussions, conversation. So please, if you're on YouTube and watching, please do make a note, ask some questions in the chat, and also in the room as well, do think of some questions as we're speaking. So we'll hopefully come to you later, so that would be wonderful. We'd love this to be as interactive as we can, so we look forward to hearing your comments and questions as well. Also, I just wanted to thank Mariam Janssen-Youssef from APWLD, or MDM Germany, for organizing this session and for inviting us to be on the panel. So thank you, Mariam. And before I provide a quick overview to this session, I'm just going to ask each panelist in turn just to very quickly introduce themselves, essentially who you are and who you're working with, and we won't spend much time on that at all. So first of all, I'll ask Misun, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. It's a bit strange because I cannot see you or the room, so I feel like I'm speaking to myself. But yeah, my name is Misun. I'm a regional coordinator at Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, in short, APWLD. We are a feminist membership-driven network, and we have over 330 member organizations coming from over 33 countries and territories across the region. And yeah, we believe in the power of the feminist movement and solidarity with other movements to achieve the systemic change and advance women's human rights and development justice. And I'm calling in from Chiang Mai, Thailand.
Thank you, and we appreciate it. It's difficult, but we really appreciate you being with us, Misun, online, so thank you. John.
Hi, everybody. My name is John Bryant. I'm a researcher with the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI. For those of you not familiar, it's a non-profit global affairs research institute based in the UK. Hi.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Margret Müller. I'm the Deputy Humanitarian Director with Oxfam. Great to meet you.
Got my own. Hi, everybody. My name is Mehdi Poyan. I'm the responsible desk officer here at the GFFO for principles of humanitarian assistance and aid, and responsible for our strategic portfolio focusing on localization, risk sharing, and security. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Sian, I'm William. I'm working with Sphere, and Sphere has a handbook, which is very handy guidance. So if you haven't heard about us, do look us up online. So since the 1990s, humanitarian assistance has broadly quadrupled in line with the needs. So the system has quadrupled in terms of size, the amount of money that's coming in, the amount of staff who are working for various agencies related to the humanitarian sector. And that was born out of initially the crises, including Rwanda and Bosnia and Chechnya and so on. But it's a very different sector now than it was 30 years ago. There are some good aspects that have remained, but there are also some structural issues that we're working through as a sector. So that's what we're going to be getting into now. The briefing talked about an elephant in the room, the elephant being the needs going up while the funding is going down. But as we know, elephants are social animals. Wonderful social animals, very kind to each other, and elephants live in a herd. So there's more than one elephant. So I'm just going to talk about some other elephants in the room, just to give that context as well to what we're going to be talking about primarily. So we're talking about colonial issues and the need to make a step change in decolonizing aid. That need for transformational change rather than just incremental. There's a debate in the humanitarian sector about Wilsonian versus Dunantism, but also what does that mean in terms of the decolonization language and terminology? The politicized aid, the localization versus locally led, and how that's still a debate rather than an absolute guaranteed point that is accepted and still discussed and talked about by all, and not talked about localization, but talked about locally led. The erosion of international humanitarian law, and the fact that the UN Security Council is very weak at the moment, and what does that mean in terms of humanitarian aid actors? The fact that there is so much conflict now, there are so many conflicts happening as we speak, climate chaos, and, for example, cybersecurity and so on. So there are many elephants in the room, and we know those elephants, we keep naming them, but what we're going to talk about now is, let's move the dial on from the fact that those elephants are here, and the fact that we keep saying this sector is not fit for purpose, but let's move the dial on that conversation. So with that, Misun, we're going to hand over to you first. So from your perspective, how is the funding landscape rooted in structural issues? Over to you, Misun.
Yeah, thank you, William, for the question. And yeah, thank you for, again, having me in this space, because strictly speaking, I'm not coming from the humanitarian sector, but rather the development sector. At least that's how we are categorized by most of the funders. Maybe I would like to actually instead ask a question back to you, since when, or has there ever been a moment when any kind of funding, be it humanitarian aid or development aid or justice aid, or you name them, those aids are free from power and politics? And more specifically, has there ever been a case when funding was free from any political agenda of the global north and genuinely driven by and designed to support people's rights to self-determination and sovereignty? Additionally, when does the humanitarian crisis become a development crisis, and where and when do we draw the line? And I want to ask some of the questions for our thinking, like, is poverty, death, or human suffering from war and conflicts humanitarian concern? Or is poverty, death, or loss of dignity due to economic crisis humanitarian, or are they labeled rather as development crisis? Is food insecurity due to war and conflicts humanitarian crisis? Then how about food insecurity due to debt or other macroeconomic crisis? Is it a humanitarian crisis, or are they development crisis? And when and who decides a country or community needs urgent humanitarian aid while not prioritizing other country or community? I don't actually have answers to all these questions, but I pose these questions for our critical discussions and reflections. And as we know, humanitarian crises are a consequence of structural issues, and most often different forms of crisis, including humanitarian ones, are the consequences of macro-political, economic, and social structure and decisions. For instance, I think you talked about the Security Council, William, but we must look into the nexus between macroeconomic policies or power and militarism. And let me give you some facts to think about this nexus, yeah? So not to mention that the global military spending is on an ever-increasing path. The UN Security Council, the mechanism when it comes to peace and security of our international community or humanitarian support, is actually composed of the UK, US, France, 3 of them are G7, China, and Russia, which are part of the G20. While the largest arms exporters in the period of 2018 to 2022 were, again, the US, Russia, France, China, and Germany, all five accounting for 76% of the total volume of the arms exports, with the US supplying 40% of the global share. 4 out of these 5 are UN Security permanent members, meaning they have veto power, and all of them are either G7 or G20. And not to forget, these countries with the largest voting power, these countries have the largest voting power in the World Bank, and they are US, China, Germany, UK, and Japan, who are not only largest arms exporters, but again, part of G7 and G20. In addition to this, I have another interesting data for you, which you might all be very familiar with because this is a humanitarian related information. And just in 2022, it is reported that the 3 largest donors for humanitarian assistance are the US, Germany, and the EU, accounting for 64% of the globally available funds for humanitarian aid, right? But these names, you remember, just we heard again, these countries are also the top global arms exporters, and those are the ones making the global economic and financial rules through World Bank and the IMF. So the question we have is, are the actors generating humanitarian crisis and other crises the same as funders who are trying to make our world a better one, right? In my opinion, humanitarian development or any kind of aid or funding is designed to fail unless the current power structure and structural system and structural change. And further, I think we have to think any kind of aid or funding is actually a bare minimum of reparations to the extractions, exploitation, and violence conducted by those colonial power to the people in the global south through colonialism and imperialism. Yet, unfortunately, again, the aid, philanthropy, or global giving ecosystem is governed by the same political, economic, and financial power. So in order to cut the chain of those structural issues, William, that you mentioned, which is one of the many political tactics of the donor countries and people with wealth to still govern and retain the power, I think we must first acknowledge what our playing field is and start talking about them out loud. Maybe I'll stop here, William.
Thank you very much for that powerful intervention. We look forward to coming back to you later as well and unpacking some of those issues. So John, yeah, building on Misun's intervention and talking particularly about the funding crisis, do you think it's partly of our own making in the humanitarian system?
Thanks, William. I think potentially in part, yes. So reform, I think, as we can all appreciate in this room, reform in the system, when it does happen, if at all, the reforms that have happened are have impacted or left untouched some underlying narratives around aid, some of the basics around humanitarian assistance and what it should involve, right? I think they in turn have created a situation where the humanitarian system may not be responsible for the cuts it is facing now, but it's certainly very vulnerable to these cuts, I think, as a consequence of a lack of reform that we've seen over the past few decades, really. We've done a few pieces of work on this at the Humanitarian Policy Group. To take one example of humanitarian cash, this has rightly been held up as a rare example of humanitarian reform that has gone well. 10, 15 years ago, cash was less than 1% of all of the humanitarian assistance, or equal to the value of less than 1% of all humanitarian assistance. Now it's over 20% by the latest estimate. So in a system that rarely does reform, there's an example to emulate and admire there. I think the trade-off with something like that, with the way cash has gone, is that the underlying narratives around humanitarian assistance were not really questioned during that process, right? So you had cash being sold to donors a lot of the time on the grounds of greater efficiency, on the grounds of cutting costs, and this was just a more direct, more efficient way to bypass some key actors in the humanitarian system. I think in doing so, the transformative potential of something like cash may have been lost a little bit along the way, and I think you're seeing that increasingly from cash advocates, I think, who have expressed frustration that maybe the potential there for cash to facilitate a more equitable system was lost, I think. So there's an example of, even where reform has gone well, and it has gone well, those underlying narratives remained in place. I mean, a more dramatic example, I think, you know, and it's common to Germany, it's common to my own country in the UK, a lot of the increases in aid over the past 10, 15 years were justified to the public on the basis of aid over there to stop migration, right? To stop people coming and arriving. And I think that's just, you know, in situations like that, we as humanitarians really need to ask, who are we serving in that equation if we go along with that logic? There's very little evidence to suggest that aid stops migration, but that's kind of beside the point, right? Like, what are the values that we are unconsciously upholding when we go into an arrangement like that, or we leave those narratives and leave those assumptions there? So they're two examples, and they're both, you know, they're both very diverse. They've got their own, you know, contextual sort of particularities, I guess, about them. But I think both are examples of short-term gains, you know, an increase in aid, cash, at the expense potentially of challenging some really pernicious narratives that Misun was, you know, was ultimately talking about, right, around the humanitarian system, and, you know, the idea that crises are exceptional events. They necessitate external people to come and arrive. Those external people are above politics. They're not political actors. They just float in the ether above the crisis, right? And it's important to talk about this, and it's not just like a chin-strokey exercise, because these narratives are still really central to the way the humanitarian system functions, right? In the UK, there's the Disasters Emergency Committee. So the largest humanitarian organisations are members of it's a coordination and a fundraising body that launches appeals through the BBC, right? The third appeal criteria in DEC deciding whether to launch an appeal is whether there's sufficient interest from the public, right? It decides that those sets of assumptions decide whether appeals are launched or not. In the case of Ukraine, that DEC appeal, I think, broke all kinds of records for the crazy amount of money that it raised. There was an incredible statistic about, I think, 2/3 of UK adults in 2022 and 2023 donated some money to the Ukraine appeal, right? So this stuff really matters because it's still central to the way the humanitarian system fundraises. So not just an academic exercise. Just to end on a more positive note, just to say that I think a thing that comes up a lot in my line of work in research and things is just, relatively speaking, how trusted humanitarian actors still are as narrative setters and as organizations that can challenge narratives that are problematic or uphold, emphasize narratives that are positive and positive sort of humanitarian values, really. So that's something that I think in the humanitarian sector, there's often an aversion to that, right? There's, you know, it's very reactive. We think we're kind of just on bobbing along, reacting to all kinds of like external pressures. But actually, there's a lot of agency here as trusted voice setters. So potentially, yes, in part, an issue of our own making. But yeah, there's agency in this system, really.
Thank you, John. And yeah, do remember to keep thinking about a possible question or a comment. We'll come to you in a bit. I'm turning you now to Margret. Thank you very much. So listening to some of those narratives from Misun's perspective and from John's, what do you think are, yeah, they're powerful narratives as well, aren't they? And humanitarian aid is so complex, the system is complex, and all these elephants are in the room. What is the impact of these narratives, would you say, from your perspective at the moment? And how do you balance these narratives with locally led and the need to scale as well?
Thanks, that's a really good question. I think we have a tendency to want to look only at one elephant and not to look at all of them. For example, picking up from what we talked about in the morning on the need to set boundaries, to prioritize, to go back to basics. And other elements we heard is, in my understanding, following bit an elephant that leads to looking at the short term because the elephant seems big. And that's a risk. I think. We have taken enormous efforts as a humanitarian community in the last years to leave this kind of, sorry, let's call it white savior humanitarian, and going to a humanitarian sector, aiming to move towards a humanitarian sector that wants to put communities at the center. And that's been hard work, and we shouldn't let go of that now by trying to keep the numbers, reducing the numbers so that the statistics look still bearable and are not as difficult as they are. And I think by self-restricting, we reduce how problematic the picture looks, but we don't reduce needs by setting boundaries exercises where we have reduced the people that we're targeting, we reduce the people that we're counting as being in need. And when we say we go back to basics, I think one of the risks is that, what does it actually mean to go back to basics? Do we want to go to a humanitarian system that is blanket distributing by our assumption what we think is a need of a person, or a blanket need of a community at need? I think those are risks that will not reduce needs on the long run, and we need to, building on what you said on narratives, we need to trust the audience we talk to, some more of the complexity of the system. And one key issue that we have as humanitarian sector is that on one hand we follow a principled logic, that's the other section, and the other session happening at the moment, but we also follow a market logic. And we are often not honest about it, that as you just talked about the DEC example, I led the East Africa hunger crisis 2 years ago, and we were constantly overtaken by other crises that got the DEC appeal, and East Africa never made it to the news in a way, because it doesn't have the same news value as the Ukraine crisis. And that's a market logic, it's not a principled aid logic. And if we don't talk about these elephants in the room fighting each other, we are not really honest about what we do, because we coordinate and we cooperate, but we are also competing. And if we were more frank about it, it would be easier. And I think complex narratives about the realities and about what humanitarian assistance means, what localization means, and how difficult it is, and that it's not dichotomous, are what we need to go towards. So we need to reconcile different frameworks, for example, localization and responding at scale, right? It's not one or the other. But how do we do that? It's not self-implementing or the partners doing everything and us subcontracting. It's working together with who is best placed. And that can look very different. For us in Oxfam, for example, when we work in WASH, we might work with one local partner organization that is really good at building latrines or sludge management, but we are better in community engagement. So then, let's not make them a community engagement actor if they're not, and we'll do all what we can. It's the same relating to the discussion in the morning. Should INGOs still program, or should they become advocates? And I think it's both. Again, going back to East Africa, in Kenya, we're not anymore the implementing organization, but we're enabling a network of partner organizations. They are much better placed to advocate towards the Kenyan government to take responsibility for the hunger crisis than us as an INGO. But we might be better placed to advocate based on their realities, on the knowledge in international fora. So it's this complementarity, and that doesn't go just for Oxfam and partners and so on, but also for us as humanitarian sector together. I think we need to think more about complementarity instead of competing, and being more agile in that, really depending on the capacities. Yeah.
Thank you, Margret. And yeah, it's worth taking a step back as well as we look at our sector, at our system, at ourselves, just how difficult humanitarian aid is, because, well, for frontline aid workers, because actually we're working with people in perhaps the worst moment of their lives, and that moment can go on for years, but in really, really tough times. They're traumatized, they're in grief, they might have lost everything, including family members. So it's worth taking a step back and just acknowledging how hard humanitarian assistance is, particularly principled humanitarian action, but also how complex and how difficult we make it as well. We have such complex terms that are really difficult to understand, even if English is your first language. Terms like nexus, which is actually Latin, but anyway, but terms like nexus and principles that might have been taken beyond what they were originally meant to be. For example, Do No Harm, written by Mary Anderson in the 90s, that's really about a doctor-patient relationship, and she never meant it to be like an impossible-to-achieve principle, but it's there now, and that's what we hold ourselves up to account for. Do no harm. It's impossible to do no harm. And we also we're very good at criticizing ourselves. So I just wanted to acknowledge how hard it is. But just taking a step back as well, we're so good at criticizing ourselves. And in many of the statements made by humanitarians, particularly policy people, we say we're a system, we're a sector that is not fit for purpose. And we've been saying it for years, and particularly since Istanbul and the Grand Bargain. But we've been saying it for years. So turning to Mehdi now, we say we're not fit for purpose. You're one of the 3 main donors mentioned by Misun. How does that make you feel?
It's a lot to unpack, especially what everybody has said beforehand. Maybe to begin with how we perceive the situation and pick up on some points on my speakers before me. The thing is, from very specifically from the GFFO donors' perspective, how we look at the system is in an indirect manner. As we are different in this way, as we don't operate directly on the ground. That's just how we, as a ministry, are structured. So our impact directly on the local level from the operational side is rather limited. At the same time, we are, and this is also the question of how we are combating, reducing budgets, and looking at making the system fit for purpose also for the upcoming years. I mean, the needs will not go down, and the funds at the moment don't look like they're going up anytime soon or reaching previous levels. So maybe to look at the document we have published just very recently, our strategy on delivering humanitarian assistance. What we try to do is, in an overall manner, to increase efficiency, and not in an economic kind of sense, but in how our donor money will impact the affected populations. Because our absolute main goal and the overarching aim of our operations is acting on humanitarian principles and fulfilling our responsibilities globally. And this is detached from every other sector of our foreign policy. It's very specifically set up for the humanitarian assistance program, and also our colleagues from the Ministry of Economic Cooperations are acting in several parts in a similar manner. But what we see is, when we're looking at the system and how we work directly with our partners to counter a lot of the criticisms we have heard and we are seeing, and we are also looking and seeing inside our own system, is we are trying to enable our direct project partners, may it be INGOs, NGOs, and United Nations organizations, to fulfill the goals we are all aiming for and already pledged to. Because that's kind of the interesting part, is what we have seen in the previous years is there's been a lot of talk, and you have mentioned the Grand Bargain very specifically. And also when we are talking with other donors, what we are seeing is we have had the phase of discussion and alignment and setting up the necessary policies, and everybody's pledging to different kind of formats and percentages. They're trying to fulfill maybe localization or inclusion goals. But the problem is, at the moment, is it is not really going towards a proper goal of a certain percentage, but a real inclusive localization, for example. So what we try to see is, from our perspective, it's what can we do so that our direct partners are able to fulfill their goals, and really reach out to them on eye level and see what are the problems, what is hindering the whole progress, and trying to support the process on this level. First of all, in our internal structures, or how we can support the process, but at the same time, when we are looking at United Nations operations in regards to how they are acting on the ground with the affected population, but also the local organizations, what are their problems or what's hindering them to fulfill their goals? So what we try to do is align with other donors and to set up a certain minimum of expectations we have toward the system, and from that point on to move forward. Because what we have seen in the previous years is everybody's working in silos with different amounts of funding, but what lacked the most, maybe from the donor perspective, was a higher degree of alignment on the donor level, on the level with the intermediaries, but at the same time, and this is also the question in regards to inclusion of affected populations, what we also try to do is, even though we are not directly operating on the ground, we are trying to include local organizations and local perspectives as much as possible in setting up our projects. But it remains at the very end how governments are operating in humanitarian scenarios. It is a supportive measure and an emergency measure. So there's a certain degree we can influence the system, and we can influence and add or support our partners, but at the same time the political ramifications are dimensions which sometimes cannot really be counted on a purely humanitarian angle. So this is why we also added our efforts in humanitarian diplomacy to really see if, additionally to just funding and supporting with projects and money, we can leverage our diplomatic capital to support the people on the ground. Yeah. Hopefully I've answered some.
Yeah, and we'll be coming back to that as well. Thank you, Mehdi. So John, listening to that, and without giving an answer, it has to be more locally led. But what do you think are some of the other potential solutions to the kind of the crisis that we're in now?
Yeah, I mean it's difficult to avoid saying locally led action, of course, because it hasn't happened in any kind of at scale as has been discussed. So that remains flexible and efficient funding mechanisms remain the goal, I think, in terms of an enabling a better, more effective system. Heber Ali talked in the plenary about this idea of localization under, as an enabler now, as a necessity, and I think I'd subscribe to that as well. There's also anticipatory action, I think, which is increasingly, an agenda at the high international level. The UK government's committed £2.5 billion, I think, this or next financial year for anticipatory climate finance. I think, ironically, if humanitarian aid isn't sort of, if there's not work done to include humanitarian assistance into that, then the funding squeeze might be even greater, because those commitments need to come from somewhere. So I would say linking humanitarian assistance with those longer term climate funding is essential. And I think just the idea that people still do want to help, when they see humanitarian needs, right? And people still, we were saying earlier that amount potentially has gone down, I think, but there are still people who see suffering and want to donate and help, and maybe that's changing in terms of its character. Perhaps you're seeing more, we could call it solidarity-based aid, right? That perhaps I just don't think should be. I think it's now too big to be. It can't just be ignored. It needs to be kind of engaged with and navigated. And I think it's not just the case that there's kind of principled humanitarian assistance on one side and, this kind of hyper-partisan, completely entrenched sort of giving money to whoever on the other side. I think we did a piece of work, and colleagues who are in the room today from Poland and Ukraine, who are brilliant, we did a piece of work recently on narratives relating to the Ukraine war, and something I took from that was actually a bit of a hopeful point around. We asked people, aid users and aid providers, what they thought of when they, what standing in solidarity with Ukraine meant to them, right? What does this kind of hyper-partisan, not very humanitarian-seeming support, what does it actually mean to them? And I was quite heartened by the results from that, because I think people have a potentially more inclusive and universalist kind of view than I think we give them credit for sometimes, even in situations like that, when it obviously is motivated by, you know, by that war and the Russian invasion. So there's a lot going on. There's an entire alternative kind of system of assistance out there and flourishing and working at scale that clearly needs to be engaged with. For me, the huge, another elephant in the room maybe, is particularly when it comes to the localization agenda, is the state, like the affected state. That's just, even in localization circles, is just not really mentioned very much at all. And it's not a panacea for everything, but there are some really powerful examples now, you know, countries like Indonesia, like the Philippines, who have, you know, were quite assertive with limiting international humanitarian organizations in crisis response, and are now real examples, I think, to potentially sort of learn lessons from about how do you do crisis response at a, you know, run by the state rather than a parallel response system. And I think it's, you know, it's to the detriment of crises like Ukraine that you know, that social welfare systems weren't turned to more quickly by the international system. So there's a lot of avenues, I think, out of the you know, this coming crunch. But, you know, there's a lot going on, I think. So it's not all completely doom and gloom.
Yeah, no, thank you, John. Yeah, and so if we can pull you back in, Misun, you've been listening to someone who works with an international NGO, with the Humanitarian Development Advocacy Brief, from someone from a policy and research agency, and someone from an institutional donor state ministry. And from your perspective, listening to these narratives and these avenues out of this potentially existential crisis, Misun, can you show us any more opportunities or pathways that we should be particularly focusing on?
Yeah, thank you, William, and all the speakers. I wish I were there with you guys. I think my answer is not that positive as far as the current system is not changed, right? And seeking opportunity within the same oppressive system wouldn't lead us anywhere far. And I say this because the current rules of our world, from political to social, economic, financially, and even to cultural rules, all of those are deeply affected, if not designed to follow the legacies of colonialism. And unless and until we dismantle and shut them down piece by pieces, I doubt that there will be any meaningful opportunity for us to stop any kind of humanitarian and other kind of forms of crisis. And for that deep structural and systemic change, I would like to emphasize that movement resistance and future building needs to be connected and drive resources. It's not about localization, because, you know, localization, all that fancy words are just aiding whatever donor narratives, seemingly giving some power to the local communities, but no, within the given framework that is designed by the development agenda of the donor countries, for instance, right? And it is crucial to build and foster a political unity on how we understand our context, and also on what kind of a breakthrough that we would like to make and how we do it, especially to realize the people's right to self-determination. And some of us talked about solidarity-based or decolonialization, but decolonial or decolonizing solidarity will require actions from the movements that intentionally and politically not only share, but shift power within our own movements as well. And that includes within the humanitarian development sectors and civil society, as well as the donors. And that power shifting includes shifting political and financial resources from the global north to the global south, which requires overall overturn of the structure and system. For instance, I did some research, and not surprised, but surprised to see again the list of 173 non-governmental organizations certified as EU humanitarian partners for the period of 2021 to 2027 confirms that all of them, 173, without any exception, are NGOs based in Europe, without any exception. So where does the money largely stay? And this is in the context of the humanitarian. And we keep hearing about the localization or locally led, whatever. The so-called development aid or larger resources for civil society isn't that different because, for instance, according to the recent research, the US Foundation, which is kind of the largest of the private foundations, continue to rely on intermediaries headquartered in the US, with 61% of the global giving being directed to the US-based organization. 27 directed to intermediaries in countries other than the sites of the implementation, and fewer than 13% of the global grant donor or dollars going directly to organizations operating in the country served by the grant. So what does this tell us again? There is an urgent need from all of us who are part of diverse communities and movements to say no to funders picking and choosing whom, what, and for now, how long to fund. Saying no to cutting ourselves to fit into a category of humanitarian, development, climate group, emergency, or gender diversity, Asia-Pacific region, or other regions, etc., and made to compete over each other again and again. Saying no to a decision on a crisis in Europe, resulting in the funds from Asia and the Pacific and other regions being pulled out and invisibilize people's connected struggles anymore. And again, saying no to talking about funding ecosystem or resourcing in humanitarian development without talking about the change that needs to happen in macroeconomic, financial, and political structures and decisions. And I think it is really important to acknowledge that the wealth and resources private philanthropies and rich countries sit on is not something created by the global north, but the crisis, including wars and conflicts happening again and again in the global south, is something that is actually created because of the power dynamics. Right? With this, I invite actually all of us to really think about, it's not about needs, and it's not only about people wanting to help each other, but it's about the power. And we have to really dismantle that power and existing system that channel resources and wealth from the developing countries to wealthy countries, and from people to corporations and elites. And that means many of us today in the room and online must give up our own privilege, wealth, and power so we can meaningfully talk about how do we connect our struggles and really shift the power from the hands that we have at the moment to really to the people who have been violated for generations after generations. I'll stop here, William.
Yeah, thank you so much, Misun. And then just building on that, Mehdi, if we can turn to you now. You've talked about the new strategy just been released by GFFO, and the overarching objective is really to enable agencies and the system to be more efficient. And then can you just speak into how you marry that drive for efficiency and the desire for more locally led action? How do you marry that with continuing to support, let's say, middle agencies? So going through organizations, maybe large partners, and then that gets through down the line to more locally led action. Thanks.
Thank you. But beforehand, maybe just to add to Misun's dialogue, maybe a few sentences. The thing is, not really going into detail in regards to the overall discussion. It should be always taken into account that when we are operating from may it be from the donor side, maybe from the level of UN agencies or intermediaries, NGOs, the idea and the goal are in a lot of cases very similar or the same with on the local level and even what the affected population wishes for. A very easy example is on the local level, they don't really care about if it's humanitarian assistance or development assistance. They really don't care, and we know they don't. But from the administrative side, it is rather different, because if you go into development assistance and developmental cooperation, it is a political tool, which is also declared as one. Humanitarian assistance and humanitarian aid, very specifically, is a non-political tool, and it's needs-based and it's principled. So for us to be able to operate in regions where we would normally not engage politically, it is sometimes really important on the governmental level to really declare it or have it flagged as humanitarian assistance. And this is also something we have to keep in account, because the money and the funds we are spending from the government side is not our own. It's very much taxpayer money, and we are also held accountable on the way we are spending it. And interestingly, because I have these discussions in a lot of cases, because if you go into the list of our partners, you would also see most of our INGO and NGO partners are traditionally German in a way, or have offices in Germany. But the odd answer is we don't have a policy set up for it to be like this, but the process of receiving funding from us is, let's be honest, rather arduous and complicated. So most organizations, and we have been approached by not like grassroots organizations, but national organizations from the Global South. And they've contacted us and asked, are they eligible to receive funding? Yes, they are. But I'm telling them in the same breath, are you ready for the process? Because literally you have to hire someone who's fluent in, we call it Beamtendeutsch, like administrative German. And I'm saying this because, like, even for me on my post, if I'm looking through the documents, it is really complicated. But at the same time, and that's the question in regards to the system fit for purpose. At the moment, the way we are funding projects is essentially not different if you're operating in a highly volatile risk country as someone receiving funding in France. So this is a problem we have already identified. And we are trying to counter and increase the efficiency internally from our side to see what kind of legislative leeways or changes in the law we can achieve, but it is a long process. But we have identified it and we are working on it to kind of shift these kind of possibilities. But again, sometimes, and this is kind of the interesting part, there's not like a aimed goal of hindering or stopping the system to be more inclusive towards the Global South, but sometimes it's just an effect of how processes are set up, aimed at the typical INGO, NGO structure, also in regards to due diligence reporting back to us how they have spent the money. And at the same time, and this is kind of what we are trying to achieve, is we have seen the debate and we know the debate, and we are in direct contact with the local level and the affected population. We are trying to increase this even further, not only from headquarters here in Berlin, but also from our structures and embassies in the regions, to, first of all, lessen the obscurity in a lot of cases across the delivery chain of projects, which is prevalent towards the back donor, and have the local organizations feel able to contact us directly, to not only be directly involved in setting up the project, but also along the delivery of the project, to really be able to voice their needs and concerns directly to us. That's one of the things. The other thing is, as I've said, as we are not really able to fund them directly, what we are trying to achieve is we are looking into direct funding mechanisms, for example, via the United Nations, to see why currently, and it's really, really different if you look at different regions. We have pooled funds in regions with a really high degree of inclusive local involvement, and we have pooled funds in different regions where the localization is near to 0%. So we are trying to identify the problems, we are trying to align with other donors, and have this kind of power shift, at least sounds like a minimum goal and then we are done, but we are beginning massively and really with large-scale efforts within the United Nations structures to see what is the problem, how can we tackle it, and align with other donors who all have the same goal of really shifting this kind of power responsibility and having a high degree of inclusiveness towards the affected population in regards to how the aid is delivered and set up. That's the one thing. In regards to how we are looking to align this all with our strategy, what we have seen is, in a lot of cases, we have different approaches, and anticipatory action has been mentioned, localization has been mentioned, and we have worked on these different kind of streams of policies and operational pilots, but what we try to do now, especially in accordance to our new strategy, is to really knit together all different approaches into a cohesive idea, including also social cohesion aspects of the project. So what we're trying to do is also align not only the humanitarian assistance contexts with our across the nexus and the HTTP and the small and the big piece. Depending on this, it's a lot of words again, and most of them don't mean anything to the people affected. But what we try to do is really see that if we're engaging in a specific project from our side, to really align every different measure, have it coordinated not only inside our own ministries, but also with other donors and UN agencies and NGOs, to have an effective and direct impact, a positive, effective, inclusive impact on the affected populations, and have a long-lasting impact in regards not only to short-term social cohesion, but also to our lasting peace, hopefully, in a way. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mehdi. So coming back to you, Margret, it would be great if you could just, maybe from your perspective with being Oxfam's Deputy Humanitarian Director, how can we therefore improve our own impact, particularly as NGOs, but in the sector? But how can we improve our impact and performance in light of all these very difficult challenges?
Thank you. I'd like to say something about aid being political first, and then I'll get to us being impactful. I have a question mark there. Looking at the strategy, sorry, we'll talk about GFFO now as an example, but looking at the strategy that came out in September that says indeed specifically that contributes to the security, aid will be given to Lul, that contributes to the security of Germany and Europe, raises question marks to me about how this is not political, because that there is an interest linked, right? And it's also what we've been observing with a number of donors, and it's really what Misun said and raised is the agenda setting. We go where the eyes are, where the attention is, where the interest is. It's not delinked from political interests of the donor nations. At the risk of saying something a bit controversial, there was a controversial debate when the Ukraine crisis hit of, does it actually make sense to raise institutional funding for a European nation such as Poland having full capacities? Is that actually within the humanitarian mandate? And it's something we need to think of. So is this not political? So I think we have a lot of question marks there, and how much it is not political then. And I leave it at that and go to, am I going to the, okay. But then I'll go to
Okay, it's not an unsurprising remark, I have to say. It's not something I've not been told ever since September and the release of our strategy. I think what's important to mention in this context, and you have described it, if you look at it, what we try to aim for in regards to how we introduce the strategy is setting up a chapeau, like a frame for what's coming on in the content. And if you look at the frame, it's the rough frame of where a lot of debates are taking place. And that is true. The debates around a lot of humanitarian scenarios and how we engage in them are highly political. That is something we will not negate also from government side. You have mentioned Ukraine, you have the crisis in the Middle East, you have also the neglected crisis in the media and public eye in other parts of the world. But what we're trying to do is, by introducing the debate and having it contextualized in a security context, maybe even, to kind of engage in what is already happening in parliament, in society, on the streets, but also sometimes among colleagues in the sector. What was important for us, if you go into the debate like this and acknowledge that a lot of debates and a lot of topics and contexts and regions are highly politicized anyways, our work will still be fully principled and needs-based. And this is something we have assured, and this is the very next sentence where let's say, the content part of the strategy starts, and hopefully you would agree with this, and what comes after is rather technical and operational part of the strategy. But what we really try to assure, also in even contextualizing it with the beginning, and sometimes it is misunderstood, and this is why we have this debate in a lot of cases, that nevertheless our goal and how we will operate in the next years, and we have been operating ever since, will be principled and needs-based. But I have to mention also in this context that it is an interesting debate to have with us from the donor side, because Germany very specifically, and hopefully also in the future, is a very principled donor. And we have been and will be. But what we are seeing at the same time is that, contrary to us and a lot of other regions, the humanitarian scenario is highly politicized. And this is something we are trying to actively counter. And we would hope for more support in that debate, too.
Hold your thought, Margret, on performance and impact. And also, might be asking you about quality and accountability as well. But I did promise some comments, feedback, questions from the room. So I'd love just to open it up now to a little bit of Q&A. What we'll do is we'll take 3 or 5. We'll see how it is in the room. I'd also love to hear from Anna, who I think is monitoring the YouTube, and if there are any comments coming in from there, shaking her head. So let's just stay in the room. So yeah, the gentleman here, there are some very kind people who will be delivering. So we'll take a few comments. Try to keep them brief-ish.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much. My name is Pat McMahon from Mothers First. I suppose a few things that I haven't heard so far today is that human rights and the human rights treaty base. Also, the idea of resilience building. I think we have this idea of humanitarian action is immediate action, but actually humanitarian action, even within the sphere standards, is very much talking about resilience building. And I suppose one of the questions I'd like to specifically ask is, you know, the funding gap that has been chronic funding of humanitarian response plans means that the resilience building programs haven't been supported. And I just wonder, does the panel feel that this is kind of a reciprocal cycle that is creating more humanitarian needs because we're not actually building resilience, we're not seeking to achieve kind of sovereignty and food sovereignty within these contexts?
Brilliant, thank you so much. Let's take a few more. Yep, I can see a hand, but I can't see who the hand belongs to. But yeah, please.
Now it is. Sorry. Now it is. I have a question for Misun, because your plea for us to saying no to competing over funds that push a colonial agenda is very much resonating with me. But as a student just venturing into the humanitarian field, I wonder where alternative funds could come from, if not from governments.
Great, thank you. Very specific question. Yes, please. I can see a gentleman there in a purple-ish shirt.
Hello. This question would go to Margret. Well, in the context, or what I think you kind of imply when or what you wanted to say is that the Ukraine crisis kind of overshadows many other crises in this world. And that, well, humanitarian aid is a political tool. But what I'm wondering in that case is that how can we or how can the humanitarian field in general shift the focus back to those crises in times where it's, I mean, as difficult as we already said with all those elephants, and especially when I think of Germany as well and the kind of populist rising, how is that in any way realistic?
Great. Yep, we have space for 1 or 2 more. Or is everybody desperate? Okay, yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Amelia, I'm with Europe Cares, and I have a question, I'd say for Margret and Misun, but also open to all opinions. You were talking about market logic and principled logic, and my question is, how do you propose we can ensure the integrity of the humanitarian work that we're doing and attempt to still receive funding and also notoriety from the public where it's really important?
Great. I've got last orders at the bar. Otherwise, I'm going to turn to Margret first. Yeah, if I can ask you to respond to those and also on my earlier question, that would be wonderful. Thank you. Well, just particularly the one about resilience and the fact that there's a 30% gap always in every funding appeal Is that a game that we're playing as NGOs with donors, and what does that mean in terms of long-term support? Is it just sticking plaster, or is it going to address some root causes? And how, if you can speak into that, and if you can also speak into that integrity point, but also performance quality. But
small questions
all in 1 minute, yeah.
It's a really good question, and goes back to what we discussed earlier about setting boundaries and going back to basics, which would again be just putting little patches on chronic issues, structural issues, and bigger problems. And I checked with a colleague this morning in the morning session when they talked about the costs of water trucking and in Somaliland. Actually, so I was in Somalia last year, and a borehole is impressive work. It's like 300 meters deep, and it costs 300,000 roughly, and then you have maintenance costs. But it's incredible because it supports like at least 3,000 people, and it's incredible work. But it's really expensive. Who wants to fund a 400,000 borehole and then the maintenance costs? But then, sorry, now I'm switching country because I only got the numbers from Uganda. But the costs are roughly the same, right? So in Uganda, there was a time when the sector spent 500,000 per day on water trucking. So that's a borehole per day. But the thing is, because how our humanitarian system is set up, and that's exactly what you say, communities don't care where the money comes from. But what we do often at the onset of crisis is that we assume it's a short crisis. So we start with patches, and then after several years, now we need to go to development aid, but we've already spent a number of years of water trucking. I'm simplifying, but I hope you understand the thought with me, is that we now know that conflicts take about 20 years at the onset. So let's not start with water trucking. If we can start, clearly in Gaza is not the point of time where we can do borehole drilling, but when we can, we need to think long-term from the beginning on. And that's an issue that we often don't get to, that we advocate towards with our donors, and we have a struggle there, but we need to think resilience from really the first months onwards. An issue about quality and effectiveness is, and I'll talk a bit about something that we think about a lot, and it's not easy process of thinking, and I can't say we're done with it, is what does decolonialization as an INGO, as an NGO, what does it mean? What do feminist principles mean in humanitarian aid? It doesn't mean cost effectiveness so much as clear, and the debate is a lot about power, our own power, being reflective of our own power. And then what does this mean when we work with communities? Whose success is it, a project? Who defines the success of a humanitarian project? Is it the donor? Is it our donor report? Or is it communities? Who defines what their needs are? Now I'm going to talk about an elephant. When we asked communities in Cox's Bazar what their biggest challenge is, they said the elephants. Clearly that wasn't in our needs analysis, and we didn't have a means to respond to it, but it sometimes speaks to how we speak different languages, and we didn't reconcile that. So that's something that we need to get much better at, but it's complex. Because if you spend actual time talking with communities, what would be successful support with you, then we might get answers that we're not prepared for in our sectoral systems. So we need to spend more time on this again on the onset. I know I'm making it more complex, but that's our reality. And then that goes to your question about what do we do when, let's say, our narratives and our priorities don't align with, let's say, the agenda set in, for example, the German society at the moment. And it's a struggle that we all have, I think, as humanitarians, is how do we successfully set agendas. And I agree with you, we have lots of agenda setting power, and I wonder if we always use it to the right means. And I think sometimes we are still too simplistic in exactly the narratives that you mentioned. Oh, there's helpless victims, and we come and we help, and we don't trust them to understand that there's complex and able societies, and we can do so much to assist them in their path, and so on. So I think we need to entrust people, especially in this time of growing mistrust with what we do. We need to entrust people with more of the complexities that we deal with, to be less simplistic in what we do. But we also need to understand that, for example, there's a really short attention span. our learning is at the moment that societies at large we always jump from one crisis to the other, right? We really struggle with saying, yes, Gaza and Sudan and DRC and West Africa as a society, right? We struggle with this, but sometimes I wish, what I really appreciate, for example, is the approach of MSF, then saying, we raise global appeals, trust us to be the professionals in spending that money right. And that's a bold approach that I really appreciate and like, and it's then about us to defend, to showcase that we really are good in spending that money effectively. So far, I hope I answered some of them.
Yeah, no, fantastic, thank you. Yeah, and if we can turn to you next, Misun, I don't know if you heard that specific question, asking for what are the other options that we might be considering about. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for all those comments and questions. I will just have a few points. First of all, I cannot agree more to the first person who gave a comment on the point of resilience building. And I have to say that many words were co-opted, and there is a big resistance is another big word that is being co-opted. And used actually against having a totally different meaning. And I feel that us in the Asian Pacific, in the context of the climate crisis or environmental disaster or economic crisis, and we are keep asked, you will be hit again, are you being resilient? Okay, another hit goes here, and then are you resilient? Okay, another hit here, can you be resilient, right? So until when we have to be resilient to respond to the crisis that we actually haven't created, right? So again, it cannot, as you rightly said, the humanitarian actions are supposed to build the power of the people. But the current context and the ways of how the humanitarian assistance is decided is not designed to shift the power and actually empower the people. And even the word empowerment is very much pinkwashed and co-opted. Second point on not to compete over limited resources. And as Margret mentioned, that we will be in a chronic cycle of crisis of funding gap. ODA caught flatlining of the private foundation donors, and then there are many buzzwords in the climate urgent response or different sub-regional funds and finance, the role of the intermediaries. But the question is, are there really new money, the good resources, or is it being simply recycled or shifted to one from the other in the name of differently packaged items? And I think another point is that the humanitarian assistance, as well as the larger development aid, and including the private donors' money, the areas or thematic priorities, whatever we name it, the areas where the most of the money goes to include health, education, food, and water, right? But those crises in terms of health, food insecurity, education crisis, unclean water, and environmental disaster, it cannot be separated from the economic decisions or coercion where many of the developing countries are forced to privatize our public services. So at the cost of privatizing health, we have to depend on the aid. At the cost of privatized health and education system, and food, because the food item has to be commodified to meet the trade deals, then we have to rely on food aid. And at the cost of whatever food insecurity, again, the development aid is cut from our region, for instance, right? But to answer your question, there are some practical ways, and that's the political demands that has been from the Global South feminists and other people's movement. First, many of the countries in the Global South has been in a chronic cycle of the debt crisis because of the political and economic decisions made by IMF and World Bank to get the loan to start with, or get the aid, right? Then, can we imagine if the amount that the government have to spend to service the debt is actually freed up? Second, military budget. If that can be freed up, including from the donor countries, and actually meet your ODA commitment, there would be more resources. Tax the wealth, it has been the political demands of the movement for a long time. It's not going to happen. Tax the corporations, not going to happen anytime soon. And also to rectify the unjust and unfair, unequal trade rules, right? So these, all the political demands are deeply structural, and it will not be easy to achieve that, because that means that the entire political and economic power has to be shifted and fairly distributed. But that's, again, it's very difficult. So again, I think I'm coming back to the point that whether it is humanitarian aid or development aid, all of that is designed and following the political agenda of those who have the power and wealth. So unless we actually address and identify the root causes of those inequality of power, wealth, and resources, we will be in a cycle of competing over limited resources, in a chronic panicking mode, because the money will only get shrinking and shrinking and shrinking furthermore.
Thanks, Misun. And yeah, I just wanted to make a short intervention as well. Just my concern about the quality of principled humanitarian action. As the funding is going down, we're all talking about it, it's very evident. Some organizations are closing. There's going to be definitely a pinch on the need to focus on quality from many people's perspective. But I would say that's wrong, because if we're talking about going back to the 80s or 90s, if we're talking about going back to basics, and if we're thinking about throwing out the point about quality or the point about minimum standards, we're really talking about throwing away our desire as humanitarians to treat other people with respect and with dignity. The whole point of Sphere was actually not about standards itself or professionalization. The whole point of Sphere was to say, we failed after the camps in Goma, after the Rwandan tragedy. We failed as humanitarians. Not only did we not convey dignity to people, we actually made the situation much worse. So let's ensure that when we do principled humanitarian action, we are respecting people's dignity. And if quality is not being talked about, and it hasn't been talked about for some time, it's primarily we're talking about accountability, but quality and accountability go hand in hand. If we're not talking about quality, then we're beginning to give up on what it actually means to be a humanitarian. That other people have humanity, that this is enshrined in the UN Declaration on Human Rights. So it's so important. So yeah, I just wanted to remind people about that. There's a couple more interventions that I'd like from Mehdi and John before we wrap up as well. So Mehdi, there was a question there related to the Ukraine, and I'd like you just to speak into that and also what you heard from the other questions as well.
Always getting the easy ones, I see.
You did ask for them.
I think in regards to kind of looking into the political ramifications of different regional contexts, it is what we try to do, what we have already been doing, always have been doing, and will do in the future, is see where our money from the donor side directly in parentheses, has the most impact and is necessary for the system to really function. So our responsibility to the Ukraine crisis, which is directly in our neighborhood, is larger and is also perceived as larger from other donors at the same time than crises, for example, in South America. So this doesn't mean we don't assess them as the same needs, but what we do is by aligning with other donors, we are trying to kind of balance out our engagements and also the donor money in different scenarios. But at the same time, and this is really important for us also to mention, as we are also one of the largest donors into the United Nations system, even if we are not directly engaged in a regional context, may it be broadly Asia, but South America also as an example, nevertheless, around about 1/5 of a euro of every dollar, euro, whatever you are counting it, out of pooled fund mechanisms is donated by the German government. So we see our responsibility globally, but what we see is when we are assessing where we are engaging most directly is where we have the most impact. into the system and how we can help the people the best. And at the same time, and this is also part of our assessment and a part of how we are prioritizing the system, currently as our funding is going down at the same time, what we are looking into is not just roughly cutting our budget in every project and scenario by around about 50%, but really looking into the nitty-gritty of every single humanitarian catastrophe we are trying to elevate and support the people on the ground, and see where our money has the most crucial impact on really keeping the system alive, basically. So we are not retreating from scenarios where we know that our contribution is the most crucial, but we are trying to reduce our direct engagement in regions where we know that other donors are going to increase their engagement and stepping up and, yeah, basically stepping in. And at the same time, one of the things we are also trying to really engage with more and increase hopefully in the future is when we are talking about power structures and shifting the power not only from the traditional donors to the affected populations, it's also a question of responsibility and global responsibility. If you look at the industrial nations and the income of different nations, the contribution from certain countries is still, in percentages, a lot higher than from other nation actors who you should be expecting a lot more. So what we are trying to do is we are engaging more with non-traditional donor nations. We are very successful with this with partner countries in the Middle East, for example, where they are stepping up not only bilateral humanitarian assistance, but also coordinating more with traditional donors, for example, Germany, or maybe the USA, to increase the engagement of the global society to elevate or help to support affected populations. So it's not only just reducing, but also expanding and having newer actors engage into the field. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And yeah, John, I'm going to turn to you. So every day is a school day, as they say. Okay. But we also say we're really bad at learning as a sector. Coming from the research background as you do, have we moved the dial in this conversation in terms of what are we learning? What have we learned? Are you hopeful that we're learning? Are we progressing? Has this been a good conversation?
Oh, yeah. It's been a good conversation. I just wouldn't want to give us too much credit in terms of moving dials and things. Yeah, I mean, the learning in the sector, it's, yeah. It's not a completely terrible picture in terms of, you know, learning and reform, as I've mentioned up at the top, right? There have been notable reform successes. They were built on a strong body of evidence. You know, there was clearly research that worked in those places. I guess in terms of thinking about the narratives and, you know, the role that they have in terms of reform and perhaps, you know, being more important than evidence, really, in terms of what gets done and which crises get covered. I guess what worries me about a back-to-basics approach and a pinch in funding is that the narratives remain, but the resources, which are already tiny, in terms of like the R&D budget of the humanitarian sector, if you want to call it that, is just like non-existent compared with, as a proportion compared with other sectors. I guess you know, in a time of decreased funding and difficult decisions, obviously that budget is reduced, and the learning and evidence generation and the evidence-led reform and you know, policy initiatives are the first things to go. I mean, there's so many issues with that, but I mean, it would be one thing, wouldn't it, if what resulted from a back-to-basics approach would be a completely objective assessment of the millions of people that need humanitarian assistance, from least vulnerable to most vulnerable, and then you can cut off a chunk off the top. But that obviously that's not going to happen. The narratives and the double standards and the wild, you know, allocations of funding will all still stay the same, because, you know, this stuff is dictated in large part by state interests, by donor interests, by geopolitical interests. And that's, you know, that's obviously a concern. It happens incidentally on a subnational level as well, right? It's not just a case of X crises in X country gets more money than another one. Even within complex crises, you know, you have, you know, wild disparities in terms of resource allocation between, you know, areas that either have made headlines or have an existing humanitarian presence there versus areas of the same country where the humanitarian need may be just as high. You know, I wrote about this in a project on Nigeria, northern Nigeria, last year. So, yeah, I mean, this is like it's a super broad topic, and we've talked about lots of different things, haven't we? But I think the concern from a research point of view is that the resourcing for that and to drive evidence-led policy, that will be the first to go. But the narratives that we spoke about in this session will remain, right, in terms of the wider geopolitics and where the money goes to. In terms of like larger, you know, bringing other donors on side as well from like outside the OECD, I just wouldn't underestimate the impact that Gaza is having on just hemorrhaging like goodwill and support, you know, in terms of, you know, from main donors and the double standards at play here, as was talked about in this session. But I think that just really needs to be at the forefront of our minds in terms of double standards and narratives and donors and things like that. So yeah, sorry, word soup.
Don't apologize. Thank you, John. Thank you. Let me just, we're going to wrap up now, but let me throw out one rhetorical point. I joined a webinar the other day. There was a US bank fund manager who said, your problem isn't money, that she manages 30 billion portfolios, the size of 30 billion US dollars portfolios, and they're way more than a handful. Maybe 15 portfolios, all 30 billion. She said, the sector, you say you're 30 billion, that's nothing. Your problem isn't money. Rhetorical. I'm going to leave that out there. We haven't got time to unpack that. I also need, I think, to apologize to elephants. I think we've been a little bit rude about elephants. They are not bad animals. So apologize to elephants. Now I'm just going to ask each of our panelists just to wrap up. There's probably one burning comment that you'd like to leave us with. So going to you, Misun, first.
Why am I always the first, William?
I'm going in order.
I think I think the one burning comment for me is really the appeal that all of us as part of the larger people's and social justice movements should come together regardless of what kind of category that we are labeled with, whether it's humanitarian and development, because we know our struggles and realities are connected. And until we find and I articulate our solutions and how those are and should be connected, I think we'll live in the same world after generations. So maybe that's my last comment and appeal to all of us.
Thank you very much. John.
I think just a good reminder that humanitarian organisations remain, relatively speaking, respected narrative setters, and we have to use that power and that authority we have to, you know, not just push for kind of, you know, evidence-led, effective humanitarian aid, but as Misun said, the structural causes behind so many of these crises. Also, I will do a plug for my organisation, ODI, if you don't mind. We have a large piece of work that we are just starting out on state-led humanitarian action, some of the stuff that I mentioned earlier, you know, just distilling, you know, how does this work in practice? Crisis response from the perspective of states, so that'd be really interesting. We also have lots of work available online on narratives of the type that I've talked about and the impact that narratives have on humanitarian assistance. And yeah, I'll leave it there, but thank you for sharing.
Margret.
I think there are three key takeaway areas that we talked through I found really interesting. Is first, diversifying, what do we need to do in a way, right? This like we talked about diversifying the donor base, but also about can we not take funds when strings are attached or too many strings are attached, which for us at times means not taking OS funding or not taking institutional fundings for crisis where we are fully funded by societal support. Increase efficiency and impact, but really thinking about whose efficiency and impact for whom, which should and shall be defined by the communities affected. And reducing needs, not by setting boundaries to whom we count as having needs, but by really taking the long view, increasing anticipatory action, increasing climate adaptation, increasing predictable and longer perspectives of funding. Yeah, and thanking.
Thanks, Mehdi, yeah.
Okay, maybe my comment is one offer and one ask, actually. The offer is to everyone in the sector and also in academia to really approach us. We are really interested in criticism, in information, in input into our policy processes, because we are not the experts. Most definitely are not, but we are engaged in the different formats in regards to the system or also how we are operating. If you see something, comment on it. We are always interested in really reaching out to civil society and also connecting with your partners on the ground. So hopefully this is not an empty offer. A lot of colleagues know I'm always free for meetings really with your partners from the regions. And the ask is everybody in the sector and academia and everybody related to humanitarian assistance to really also reach out outside the sector, especially to really the people on the streets, have conversations in the media, in your private, in really at home, because what we see is we need more of a conversation in regards to what we're doing, how we are doing it, and what kind of impact, very hands-on impact it has on the lives of people. Because what we really believe in, also from the government side, but just generally, maybe, hopefully, as humanity, it's a big word, that if people know more about it, I think people are still and will be always willing to help other people. And this kind of setting up this kind of discussion more and be more visible about it could also help to a certain degree the funding situation in the future.
Thank you. And also, it would be great if you can give any visibility on X Twitter using the hashtag HCBerlin. If you want to make a comment or make a tweet, please do, HCBerlin. There is a networking event now, so we've been very formal here, now we can start to be informal, and I think humanitarians are very good at that. So the bar is open, I believe, at 5:30. So please stay. You can come and talk to the panelists, we can discuss, but then there is that bar at 5:30. So thank you for staying in the room and surviving this event, and particularly let's thank the panelists now. Thank you.
And also big cheers for our moderator. He's done a really good job.
Thank you. Thank you, Misun. Bye-bye.
Bye.